Is that poll still shown on your slide, Barb?
Nope, it's gone.
It's
Okay.
on mine.
Oh.
Is it? Oh.
Yeah.
You might just want to minimize it. I'm the marketing specialist at Plant Protein Alliance. I've been helping out since about January. So we have Barb Wilkinson, who's the communications manager at Plant Protein Alliance, and we have our very special guest, David Hughes, who is emeritus professor in the UK and his specialist, and he has really great stories to tell. So we're very happy to have him here with us. A little bit about Plant Protein Alliance for those who aren't familiar. We are helping to connect people in Alberta to become global leaders in plant-based ingredients processing. We have several different strategic partners, including Egg West Bio, Protein Industries Canada, and Bioscience Association Manitoba. We host lots of different networking events across the year, so we hope that you'll come and join us for another one as well. And they're very highly rated. 78% of survey respondents said that they're a great event to come to. And we also have 2 different newsletters that if you're not signed up for, definitely recommend signing up. And you can do that at ppaa.ca/communications. And now on to the feature presentation with Dr. David Hughes.
So it's 8 o'clock at night, 8:05 now. I'm talking from my home in Wales, just over the Welsh border. It's 8 o'clock, but you know that's normally beer time, frankly, or wine time. But it's a special dispensation for you guys. I'm so pleased to talk to you. Consumer behavior post-COVID and changing nature of global supply chains. And some of you will know me already, and I like to start global. And so my question is, okay, as you know, we've got the better part of 8 billion people in our world. That's a lot, 8,000 million people, 7.8 actually, but 8 will do. And so my opening question to you is, what proportion of the 8 billion live in Asia? Is it 40, 60, or 80%? That's it. So the greatest proportion are going for 60%. And what's the answer? The answer is 2020. That's 60% of our world population of 7.8 billion actually live in Asia. But if you move forward to 2050, actually the proportion in Asia declines a little. But the big number for me is that when we have 10 billion people, give or take, that 80%, 80% will live in either Asia or Africa. Why do I put that up? Because it just reminds us where the greatest proportion of the market will be as we move forward. And you know, here I am in little Europe, and it just gets proportionally smaller and smaller and smaller. And North America is an important market, but still, you know, in the great scheme of things, it's small. That's, I guess, my opening point. Moving on. Okay, and so, look, I'm doing a lot of talking in this area. It's all about COVID-19, etc. And I'm asked, what's the world going to look like when we recover? And of course, it begs the question, when will we recover? And because whatever the answer is, will determine, you know, how quickly we recover and the nature of that recovery. So I've got the question, is it a V shape? Is it a U shape? Is it a W shape or an L shape? A V shape is, here we are now in the pits, but it'll recover quickly. The U shape is, we're down the bottom and there might be a long bottom before it recovers. Will it be a W? And W could be, we're on the road to recovery now. We'll be back looking like normal or whatever that might be by, let's say, September, October, and then bang, there's another outbreak of that nasty virus and down we go again. Or indeed, is it an L-shaped where we think, right, actually, we're not going to recover for some time. So what have we got here? W-shaped recovery, up and down. My Lord, look at that. U-shaped recovery, no immediate recovery. That's something. Well, I tell you, I think you're a thinking group. Why do I say that? Because most seminars, webinars I'm part of, the so-called experts say it's all going to be about a V-shaped recovery. Indeed, the International Monetary Fund thinks exactly that. And I'm not convinced. And I'm not sure whether it's going to be U-shaped or it's going to be W-shaped. But it's worth. But clearly, there's different business strategies depending on what you think is going to happen. So let me move on. Hang on. Share results. Let me get rid of this one again. Yeah. So look, my Saturday comic, the one I just had last weekend, is The Economist. There's a great leading article there, and they take the view the world's food system has so far weathered the challenge of COVID-19 pretty well. And I agree with that. Considering the stress that it's been under, that in general, and if you look globally, the food industry globally has performed pretty well. I say I've added in, apart from the North American meat industry, which seems to have been clobbered, not least at the meat processing end. If I look at the food prices in general, right up to this time now, have generally drifted down. They haven't escalated through the roof, with the exception of rice. Why rice? Because rice is exported from about 4 countries in the world. That's all. And all it takes is one of them, and a big player like Vietnam, which is exactly the case, to ban exports. Then suddenly the world of rice consumers panic. And that's what we've seen happen with rice. But in general, the food system, I think, has done reasonably well. And in part, that reflects the cereal stocks situation, which you'll know much more about. But things, look, can still go awry. I think the big issues that we have to consider, irrespective of the shape of the recovery curve, is, first of all, we are in recession. We'll remain in recession for some time. People in general will have less income, and that will have a disproportional impact on the food that they buy and how they buy it. So personally, this is a sort of huge impact globally. Not least, there'll be more poor people around, and as a result, they'll tend to trade down. Nationally, what I notice around the world is that countries are saying, oh, actually, we've coped well, but should we be more self-sufficient? So there's a drive. I can see politicians saying we should try and increase self-sufficiency and not be reliant on international trade. The international side is what Vietnam's done. Will we see people banning exports? And clearly we've seen labor issues right across North America. I'll come to that in a minute, where lack of labor has caused supply chain problems. And also I wonder just how helpful banks have been on credit availability. In the UK, the government has backed most of the loans, and the banks are still resistant to give loans to businesses which they're unsure of over the next 2 years, even though they don't take the credit risk. Moving on. I was taken, was it last week, Barb and Shannon, or 2 weeks ago, when we had the previous PPAA seminar, and we had the good Chris Chavillo and Eunice Wong talk about supply chain problems in Canada. And I thought they sort of covered it off. So very, very quickly, I mean, clearly in Canada, the livestock and meat industry has had its problems. If you're in potatoes, of course it was a problem because you weren't selling any into food service. Milk, same thing. About half the milk we drink goes into coffee. Canadians are great coffee consumers, and you were not buying it in Starbucks or well, actually, you don't buy it at Starbucks, do you? You buy it in your own chains. And that was pointed out by Chris. If I looked at the insightful Eunice, she was saying, what can we do from a chain point of view? And what we were doing at Western, saucering, that we were getting extra ingredients to buffer our stock. We were, in some cases, minimizing production units. So we were cutting out the small scale stuff and focusing on the big brands so we could get the production efficiencies. We were minimizing visitors to the sites. We were shifting resources from food services to retail, using other truckers because our own were perhaps down with COVID, giving away excess food so we could make our mark and not be wasteful. And we were taking care of our people. I thought that sort of covered it really well. But what sort of intrigued me is we look at, okay, how did consumers respond? What did we rush to buy? Same in Canada as the US and in most countries. We rushed to buy comfort foods, old favorites, storables like chopped tomatoes, indulgent snacks, And down the bottom, for some strange reason in Canada, but also in the UK, we all went out to try and buy flour to make bread all of a sudden, something we hadn't done for decades. And here we are, Robin Hood with that sort of characteristic yellow pack. They ran out of yellow packs. And now if you buy Robin Hood, it's in a white pack. And we saw that right around the world. And it just reminded me that it's an ill wind that blows no one any good. Who's actually benefited from COVID-19 from a commercial point of view? And actually, it's big food. So Kraft Heinz, Nestle, Mondelez, for example, all posted record quarters in this year. And also supermarkets weren't sort of feeling sorry for themselves. Loblaw reporting sales spikes. The analysts are saying we should invest in supermarkets. They were perceived as being the bad boys, but now they look like strong investments. So some did well. And how might things change, or how things are changing? Here we are from CTV News, how COVID-19 could change the Canadian grocery landscape forever. And actually the focus right around the world is noticing that consumers elected, if they had the option, to shop online for groceries. Actually, Canada did, but very slowly. Internationally, Canada is a real slowpoke when it comes to online grocery. Amazon has had a sort of brilliant period. In the US, online grocery sales grew 40%, are growing 40%. In the UK, they've doubled. It's been astonishing. So not everybody has suffered by a long way. And similarly, if I look at these meal delivery platforms and meal kit providers in Canada, skipthedishes.com, done very well, thank you. Across the US, HelloFresh, Blue Apron, Sunbasket, etc., done well. And then those delivery providers like Uber Eats, Grubhub, Just Eat have done astonishingly well. I put in Uber, the taxi people, because of course they did dreadfully. Thank the Lord they had Uber Eats as part and parcel of their business, because that took up a lot of the slack. And what's more, if we look at meal kit sales, for example, which had been slow to get any traction in North America, starting to do well amid the pandemic. Actually, again for North America, as a Brit, I'm also Canadian, but as a Brit, what took us so long in North America to embrace this eating out in option? Where, you know, who buys ingredients any longer? What we want to buy is the meal solution. We've had that for years in the UK. We're not first at many things, but that ready meal option, I put in here, the £15 dinner for two in Waitrose. There's a salmon starter, steak and fries, profiteroles, and a bottle of wine for Canadian 26 bucks. Now that's a deal. Just expect to see more of it. And who's done badly? Well, we know who's done. It's those who are locked down, not least pubs, restaurants, and shops. Anybody who's in the tourist industry, the travel industry, the food service business, it's been decimated. Canadian restaurant sector laying off the better part of 1 million people in March. It's been terrible. The interesting question to ask is, so now we've got out of the habit. Well, we had to get out of the habit because we weren't allowed out for 2 months or more. When we're allowed back out again, will we reverse our habit and get back into food service? And I would suggest it will probably struggle a little. We'll be reluctant to go out because we'll be still concerned about food safety, food security. What's intrigued me is seeing how big food has responded. So here we are with PepsiCo, which has Lay's in Canada, and it's called Walkers in the UK. So producing chips. We rather whimsically call them crisps in the UK. And this sort of intrigued me. That in the UK, lockdown was announced on March the 23rd. 10 days later, Lay's had got an extra 4 varieties of chips, which were linked to food service firms, the ones you might know, like Nando's, like Yo Sushi, which you know as Bento Sushi. So you'd buy a pack of Lay's chips. Inside, it would have a voucher for a Nando's or a Bento Sushi restaurant for when it comes back. That's an astonishing response in just 10 days. And I've seen the same with Nestle. Very quickly, Nestle Health Science set up and launched an e-commerce platform. Again, on the right-hand side, big food, quick to go, direct to consumers. Again, it's PepsiCo with its Frito-Lay snacks and other snacks launching direct to consumer. because, of course, we saw this snacking surge during our lockdown. Again, that will be intriguing because I would expect to see that longer term, much more direct to consumers. And of course, that will hurt big time retailers. Moving on. But is it all about big food? No, I've just got a little tiny example here. Look, what happens if you were a small time food service operator? And here's the Royal George in Appledore, Devon. And actually it's owned by my son. He's got 2 restaurants, both are closed. And over the last 8 weeks, he's got to take a restaurant business and turn it into a takeaway business. And that's not easily done. You've got to learn really quickly. And that's one of the takeaways of the whole COVID-19 for me, is how quickly can you respond to a change in economic environment and actually get the best out of a very poor deal. On VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, do you remember that was a week ago that we celebrated 75 years? Then Garth, my son, had an afternoon tea takeaway where for $35 Canadian per couple, you could have brownies, scones and clotted cream, lemon cake, mini lemon and raspberry tarts, sandwiches, pots of smoked salmon tartar with soda bread. And how many did he sell? Not a lot. I think he sold 100, but that was 100 at 35 bucks. And so that was $3,500 that he wouldn't otherwise get. You've got to be quick to respond to these things. Let me move on. Okay, and if we can think past the immediate crisis, how many of the mega trends that I saw pre-COVID will we see afterwards? And I think the number one for me is this sort of notion of climate-friendly and planet-friendly diets. The person in Europe we think of when we hear this is Greta, the very influential, precocious Swedish girl who's sometimes extraordinarily irritating. But here we are pushing this whole notion that we have to save the planet, and she won't let go. Is this just a sort of Western economy thing? Not at all. It's right across Asia, students striking across Asia saying there's no planet B. We have to change what we do. We have to be much careful about the resources that we use, and we have to change the diets that we've got. And what's more, they're supported by, and to some extent the industry is led by, the UN and other major agencies. Plant-based diets key in tackling climate change, the UN warns. In the UK, cut meat and dairy intake by 1/5. The European Parliament, they've actually gone on hold for the moment, but immediately prior, they were talking about a tax on meat. This is real stuff, I might tell you. And it relates to the environmental impact, not least, this is one of the reasons, the environmental impact of producing food. An area which, I think, you know, if we look at Plant Protein Alliance Alberta, you must be sitting pretty. I put here the greenhouse gas emission chart for selected protein foods, and I've set everything up against beef, which is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as the real villain. So beef is 100. How else does everybody else perform? And as you can see, you're right down the bottom to less than 2 versus 100 for beef, for peas, beans, and nuts. So you're the angelic group. Brilliant, I would say. And it strikes me that there is increasing now, the argument has been made and accepted that we have to change the food system. We've got to have healthier diets, lower impact diets, more responsible use of resources, lower negative impact on the planet and people, lower rates of waste, etc. And yet at the same time, we're in the beginning of, I believe, a 4th agricultural revolution. And it's driven by, and why do we need that revolution? Because we're going to add 2 billion more people. And when you have to use every tool in the box, I would suggest, to feed them adequately. The key drivers of the agricultural revolution is work on the microbiome of plants, precision agriculture, gene editing, and alternative proteins, an area that you're strong into. And what's more, and what intrigues me, as I'm seeing this sort of like technical, scientific agricultural revolution, but it's being undertaken hand in hand with more traditional agriculture. We can see this focus on regenerative agriculture, which has a strong sustainability goal and orientation. It's sort of intriguing. So science and traditional agriculture working together. Who's doing this? Wherever I look, big food is certainly into this. I was working with Barilla in Italy recently, pasta and cookies. Actually, they buy a lot of Canadian wheat, and they're looking for regenerative agriculture from their farmer partners. I think that's big time, and it certainly has traction. Okay, looking at plant-based, it's funny enough, because of COVID-19, it looks as if it's gone off the boil because you just get less in the media about plant-based food products. Is it off the boil? By no means. Here we are with some recent consumer research. In the UK, for example, it's not about vegans and vegetarians, it's about flexitarians. It's those who are meat eaters but also want to change their diet. 90% of UK vegan meals are consumed by non-vegans. And there continues to be an astonishing launch of plant-based products across Europe. Why do people want them? Because they believe they're healthier and they're better for their wellness. They like the taste. In some cases, they think it's less costly. You know, at the top end, red meat can be relatively expensive. And for some, they're driven by this whole area of ethics and belief about reducing animal suffering, improving animal welfare, and that they're better for the environment in general. And what's more, every single national government that I can see is pushing in the same direction. Here we are with the healthy eating plate from Harvard Medical School. What are they saying we should eat more about? Choose fish, poultry, beans, and nuts. Limit red meat and cheese. Avoid bacon, cold cuts, and other processed meats. So there's a real tide, and it's going in our direction, I would suggest. And just to make the point here, again back to Europe, where major food companies and governments are saying we must move into Nutri-scoring labeling on food products. On the left-hand side down the bottom, you can see it, is where every food product will be scored between A and E, rightly or wrongly, and you'll be looking to see if you can move your products into A. And I would suggest plant-based is almost intrinsically on the A side rather than the E side. But that's just one element. At the same time as this move towards Nutri-Score, I see a move also towards EnviroScore. And I would be very surprised over the next 2, 3, 4 years if we don't see governments pushing to have an EnviroScore on most food products. What is the impact on the environment, on greenhouse gas, etc., of the product that is being sold? Again, I think that's positive for you. So, has the steam gone out of plant-based? Well, not as far as venture capitals are concerned. Here's Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, who are the two sort of crazy companies, if you will, the two great unicorns who take the majority of the funding. But look, in 2019, close to $1 billion went into plant-based meats. In the first quarter, this very first quarter of 2020, $740 million US went into plant-based meats. That's astonishing. Is it going to all be pay off? I wouldn't think so. But it's clearly starting to have traction. Here we are with Impossible Burger. Again, May 5th, bringing the Impossible Burger to 1,700 Kroger stores. It's, you know, it's real. It's not mini. And of course, it's not just for meat. It's an egg replica too. Here we are with Just Egg hitting Kroger shelves with its Just Egg made out of mung beans. Is it happening in Canada? You know it is. You can see it happening. I just put this in because it's Martha Stewart and it's got a Canadian flag on it. But it's every major fast quick service restaurant has got a plant-based offer, and in most cases they're doing very well. And so who's in this business? Every single major global meat company. JBS, Tyson, Cargill, Smithfield, they've all piled in. Why? Because they recognize it will have its place. And that's the only issue. What size of place will it have over the next 5, 10 years? And I would think a substantial place. This will be a market of billions, maybe 100 billion. It's, by the way, it's also plant-based fish. Here we are, fish-free tuna. I popped that in just for to make you smile. So moving on, but what shows me that it's got genuine traction on a worldwide scale is that big food is into it big time. So here's Nestle, who in history would never associate with these sort of products, who are heavily into it. And what's more, it's driving sales growth for them right across their business. I'll have to rush on now. Here they are with iconic brands in the US with Stouffer's and what is it, DiGiorno. Again, something that you would always associate with meat, suddenly it's plant-based. And is it again Western? Not at all. Starbucks China launching plant-based menu. Here's KFC China, produced by Cargill, selling plant-based chicken and doing so very effectively. It's not just pretend meat. Here's back to Danone. What are they doing? It's for them, it's about non-dairy dairy based on, what have we got here? Plant-based probiotics and high-protein plant-based foods. I like their Alpro brand with their oat milk, which is doing particularly well as it happens. And then there's the others, McDonald's with veggie dippers. In my market, children's snacks, which are seen as guilt-free, are full of plant-based offers. And what's more, into food ingredients, occasionally I work with Christian Hansen, a great Danish company. Here they are, normally they're into probiotics. They're one of the most profitable company in the global food industry. And what are they doing? They've developed their own super duper purple sweet potato over a 10-year period so they can use it for natural plant-based ingredients and coloring. Also, I see in the US, again, it's this focus about how can we add more protein to our crops, ultra-high soy protein being developed by Benson Hill. I'm sure you're aware of all that. And what we see here is that, so consumers have an interest in, moving forward, a much greater interest in plant-based foods, but they also want to know, where was it produced? Who produced it? What are the ingredients? Where did the ingredients come from? How were the ingredients produced? And so we're starting to see this increasing interest in traceability and transparency in the supply chain. And one way of delivering this, of course, is blockchain. That's not the be-all and end-all, but here's Cargill, AgroCorp, and Rabobank joining forces for intercontinental train using the blockchain platform. Other examples, so now you can have a cup of coffee, and as you do it, if you want to use your phone, you can track back the coffee to the bean and to the farmer in West Africa where it was produced. Who's doing that? Well, it's tech giant IBM has got the technology, but it's Mars, again, it's Cargill, it's major companies who know that this is part and parcel of just bringing more trust into food by showing consumers they have nothing to hide and that it's about transparency and traceability. So intriguingly for me, it's this sort of move towards sustainability. Let me just stop just for a second there, because the biggest impact of COVID-19, as I've already said, is that people will be poorer. When they're poorer, they change their purchasing behavior. They tend to focus on value products, and things like the environment, things like animal welfare, things like organic become less important to them because their immediate response is, how can I secure food for the family that we can afford? But very quickly, you'll start to see us move back into this whole area of, we want affordable food, but we want sustainable food. And it's focused, you can see the big companies focusing on sustainable brands and taking, for example, the United Nations Global Sustainable Development Goals. They used to be just something that was pretty to see in a UN pamphlet. Now they're part and parcel of the mission of many big companies. And what's more, consumers want to see companies have got a mission that is in tune with their own values. I've popped in here an example from the US. It's always a little excessive, but this bar saves lives. This kid saves lives. So here we've got a snacks sold into children or to for parents to buy. Buy a bar, feed a child. So here's a small company which is sort of just up and coming, if you will, but it's got a clear mission. Down the bottom, I'm not sure if we've got Mr. Brain Bar listening this afternoon, but I was very taken when I was on his website at the mission of Brain Bar. What's the mission? It's to help get fitter brains. I like that. So do consumers like that. They're looking for, how are you going to help me how are you going to help my family? How are you going to help the environment? How are you going to help our world? And I think increasingly from a business point of view, we have to show that we're making an effort and that we're in tune with our consumers. And what's more, this is an older slide, but it's a Canadian slide. We can see big finance is saying, we better get behind it. So green finance is now a 31 trillion industry and growing. And we've got Maple Leaf Foods, one of the biggest food companies in Canada, as you know well, and the Bank of Montreal working together, where the Bank of Montreal is saying, if you hit these numbers on certain criteria relating to greenness or sustainability, then we'll give you a break on the loan. I just think that's sort of indicative of what's happening. So just to sum up, it's tough, tough, tough. We've got consumers who've got lower incomes. That will immediately affect their purchasing behavior. There's much bigger focus on value, and that'll be tough for everybody in the food industry. But concomitantly, at the same time, I think we'll be back in tune with this move towards much greater sustainability in our agriculture and food industry. And what I see, just to reiterate, is this combination of really high tech, just working in partnership with traditional agricultural practices to deliver the goods and ensure that we have food for consumers, an extra 2 billion of them by 2050. And that's my lot, and I'd be delighted to take as many questions as we can.
We'll start with Jayanne says, will people be more concerned with value-based purchases and then moving back to sustainable? How long do you think that'll be as that transition?
You know, it depends on, so back to, is it a V, is it a W, is it a long U, or is it an L? I mean, I look back to, if you remember the financial disaster, was it back 2008, 2009? It was sort of really interesting around the world where consumers would trade down. And so in some markets, for example, the organic sales were down and people would trade, intriguingly, from organic to local. They didn't see it necessarily as being identical. Of course, it's not identical, but they just felt better about it. And actually, that's another point about what's happened now. There's, as I mentioned right at the beginning, there's this, when people are stressed, when they feel under threat, when they're concerned about food safety and their own health, they tend to look back to what they know. On the one hand, that means big brands that were going out of fashion a year ago, but are now back. But also they look for local suppliers and they want to be part and parcel of that local economy. So how long, so back to the question, how long would it take for them to go back? You know, it depends on the shape of the curve, but looking at the, I've got other presentations who get into this in much more detail. For example, in Asia, that where they're ahead of the game as far as work in terms of COVID-19, that even now they're moving into picking up the threads of those sustainability trends. And so I think it happens quickly.
Okay, thank you. So Allison is saying that we're seeing quite a move in Canada for people to know where their food's produced and processed.
Yeah,
and then
processed.
Their choices accordingly. And so she's wondering, do you see that trend in the UK, I guess, more broadly?
You tend to see it most in fresh foods. And so, you know, for example, in the UK, there was outrage because a couple of the supermarkets imported ground beef from Poland. And that's sort of interesting itself. Why ground beef? Because through the crisis in the UK, when people could see that their income was slipping and slipping badly, they traded down in beef, so wouldn't buy steaks, but they wanted to buy ground beef. And as a result, we ran out of UK ground beef. So, and there was a huge outcry about this. So particularly for fresh food, people tend to focus on what is local, what is national, what is regional. When it comes to processed foods, that's a different matter because they've got used to the fact that a fair proportion of their processed foods in history have not been 100% Canadian or whatever it is. It's sort of and it depends on the country. So for example, in Australia, I'm not sure what it's like in Canada. In Australia, you have to specify exactly what percentage of the ingredients are Australian and non-Australian? Is that the case in Canada? I doubt it.
No, it is not.
No,
Yeah.
no. And so you'll see pressure in that direction to become more self-sufficient, if you will, for better and for worse. I say that because, of course, Canada is a great trading company in food. And if the world goes to greater self-sufficiency, then it sort of constrains some of your markets because they say we'll produce it ourselves.
Right. And so you mentioned a plant-based market of about 100 billion.
That's from plant-based meat.
Yeah, meat alternatives.
Yeah.
So do you see a timeline for that happening? For that market
well, given that in the US it's about $1 billion now, and so let's add up what it is elsewhere, and let's say, I don't know, total globally it's 3 billion. It's got a long way to go and to get to 100. But I would be surprised if we didn't see it moving forward in leaps and bounds. Okay. And I think people, pundits, analysts say 100 because it's a round number. But I would be very surprised if it didn't continue at double-digit rates for the foreseeable future. It has a long way to go. In part, and I should say, why is it being so successful? Well, in part because of ethical reasons, more environmental, animal welfare, it's not killing animals, etc. But actually, what will really drive this, if it's affordable, one, if it's affordable, and two, if it's tasty. So never forget that. Remember, food, we put it in our mouth. If it's not tasty, they won't buy it.
Won't come
and
back.
if it's not convenient, they won't buy it, irrespective of whether it's a meat product or a plant-based product.
So if the issue is more mouths to feed, Harry's wondering why there's been negative connotations on beef production, despite the fact that the vast majority of production of beef is on pasture land, which is unsuitable for growing crops. Right,
and of course, I put up a slide showing beef at 100, and that's feedlot beef. If you look at what in Europe we'd say is dairy beef, then that would be a third the greenhouse gas impact. But one way or another, whether you like it or not, that at the UN level, at the national level, at the science level, the argument has been made and largely accepted that particularly for dairy products and for red meat products, that it has a disproportionately high greenhouse gas impact. And that if we are to expand from 8 billion to 10 billion, that if that 10 billion all ended up eating the same amount of meat as Americans, Argentinians, and Australians, then we'd sink our planet.
Yeah. And so I think there's some interest in that Nutri-Score system. Is that a standard score that a system that someone set up? Does someone own that, or
it's not interesting enough. It's supported by national governments, and it's preferred by big food companies like Nestle. There's a fair proportion of the food industry are resistant to this, but if I was to guess, I think it will have its way. And that, it's relatively easy for consumers to work out, is it an A, is it an E, is it a green, is it a red, a sort of traffic lights thing that we already have in the UK, but with slightly different criteria. And I think it's just coming, and it's coming big time. And then remember on that same slide, I'm saying, and you will see exactly the same for the enviro impact. Right. And that sort of places you pretty nicely, I would suggest.
Okay. And then if you could just talk a little bit more about regenerative agriculture. People want to understand what that is a little more, please.
Yeah, you need to talk to the agronomist, really. But my simple understanding of it is that it's looking at cover cropping. It's looking at the sort of activities that we used to undertake, and to some extent still do in agriculture, to have more biodiversity, to have and a lot of this you're already doing, particularly in Alberta. It's zero till or minimal till. And it's ensuring that by the time we've cropped, that we've left the soil in better condition than when we started. There's huge interest in this. There's a lack of understanding from many consumers, but they sort of get the point. And again, I just see that it's got real traction. And I think just to reiterate, what I find intriguing is you've got this sort of technological revolution going on with the microbiome, with CRISPR technology, with big data in agriculture and precision agriculture, but it's doing it, and it will be more successful if it does it hand in glove, hand in hand, with some of those elements of traditional agriculture that served us so well in the past. And I think that's a great story to sell to consumers. They like that.
Okay, and then regarding the BMO Maple Leaf Sustainability Linked Loan, how common are those loans in Europe and elsewhere, as far as you know? Is it
starting? It's
well established.
It's not well established. It's starting. Like everything else, it's on hold at the moment because we're just trying to cope with what to a large extent is an economic disaster. And I think banks are still trying to work out, what do we do? As I mentioned in the UK, I think it's a travesty that there's the government backing bank loans 100%, and the Barclays, the HSBCs of this world are still resistant to loan, and so they're much more focused on that than they are the more esoteric environmental sustainability linked loans. But it will come back for sure, and it will come back big time.
Okay, and then there does seem to be large support for local that we've talked about these days. And,
yes.
Seeing increases, Dana's estimating she's heard 30 to 40% increase in sales over the past 8 weeks. And so I'm wondering if that's a long-term trend that you think will continue.
Yes, it's. Will it be a significant part of our food supply? It depends where you are. Actually, I should know, but I don't know how self-sufficient you are in food in Canada. In the UK, we're about 65% self-sufficient. So we import 35% of our food. And there's always much talk about local. We need to be more self-sufficient. But actually, you can sort of double, treble, quadruple local food production, particularly for fresh food. And it's still only a small proportion of total food. I think local food will do well. It's also, I think, really useful because it gives more variety to our food systems. Because I think, if we look at, for example, the chaos, particularly in the US meat scene, how many big meat processors have you got? Is it 4 or 5? No, but no more. Now, one of those plants breaks down because of a labor problem, and then suddenly we're rationing meat in major supermarkets.
Right.
And of course, if you think back, there was a time when you had local abattoirs, and actually the Michael Pollans of this world, those who want to see a rewritten food policy for the world, will say that's what we need. And actually, we're going to see more of that, but it will still be a relatively small proportion of total food supply.
Right, and you alluded to this a little bit, that it could, because we depend so much on food exports, if people hunker down locally, that could hurt Canada in the long run.
Yeah, although, yes, it would, because it was such a major exporter. But I think it's sort of inevitable that we sort of took food for granted, or a lot of countries did. And now they're saying maybe we ought to have an agricultural policy which is more supportive. And that normally means trade barriers, frankly. From a UK point of view, there's a real push that we should be more self-sufficient. Well, okay. But as we leave Europe, that means we're more open to international trade, and the two don't fit nicely together, being more self-sufficient because we're relatively high cost, and opening ourselves up so that we have to face full on the Brazils, the Argentinas, the Australias, the Canadas of this world, who are just operating at bigger scale.
Right. So with people having had months of practice preparing meals at home, and
Yes.
and
Will they continue?
yes.
I
So
mean, that's a good question. Actually, I think in the medium term, they will take pleasure in being a little more, well, let's go back, self-sufficient at home, you know.
right.
But the fact of the matter is, you know, why are we preparing more meals at home? Because we're at home for more meals. Because the family's there for breakfast and they're saying, so what's for breakfast? They're there for lunch and saying, what's for lunch?
We
And
can't
so,
escape them. Yes.
so we can't say, well, you know, forget it. You only get one meal a day. I think that you know, food service will return, but it will return slowly. But depends actually more on the type of food service. So I think the sit-down restaurants, I'm afraid that's the sort that my son has, they'll have to work hard to get back their customers.
And the convenience meal kits delivery boon that you talked about, do you think that will be a long term?
You know, I think that's just been, it's been a long time coming. I would suggest that Canada has been a little slow in that regard, particularly at retail for that, you know, purchasing the meal solution in the
Right.
supermarket rather than the ingredients. And that when we recover, and let's say when rather than if we recover, then I just see more and more. You'll see more cooking at home, but it won't necessarily be with ingredients. They don't even know how to spell the word ingredient. What they'll be buying meal components and they'll be bolting them together at home and then taking pride in having cooked. What's intriguing, I can see it happening in my own home here, is how many people are going to continue baking their own bread. Not for long, I would think.
No, I think that might be a short-term trend.
Exactly.
So, and then as consumers start to value local food production over big food companies, do you see larger corporations attempting to compete with local to reclaim that part of the market?
You know, they tend to. Although, I mean, it depends on who. For example, what I'd expect to see, and you see it in many countries of the world already, and to some extent in Canada, excuse me, is that supermarkets will give more space for local and regional produce and products. And just because that brings a little bit of local theatre, and that's a good thing. Big food already have been and will look continually to see which of those small regional firms that are doing well, and they will look to support them initially and then buy them.
Yes.
And then buy if they think they've got sufficient traction that they can take them to a bigger line. Because look, around the world, the Danones of this world have already worked it out. Most large, big global branded companies have. Actually, the trend pre-COVID, and I think it will be post-COVID, is to away from big global brands and towards more regional, national, and local brands. And
right.
So they have to be sort of quicker on the feet. They see this as bringing in efficiency because they have to have a bigger product portfolio, but they also see the way that consumers are going. For the moment, however, as I mentioned, the Mondelez, the Oreo cookies of this world have had this sudden great boost. And it's astonishing because if you look back for the last 2, 3, 4 years, people were pointing fingers at those big brands and saying, we don't like you, you don't have the values that we have. But when we're in trouble, we like to revert
back
to what we know and what we trust.
Right. And then do you have a sense of how much of a premium the market will pay for local and or sustainable food?
You know, when you look at the survey work, that if you take sustainability, people say they'll pay for sustainability. The fact of the matter is that increasingly they expect it. And as I've said in a number of my talks, and people listening might know that the green bar is going up inexorably. Each year the green bar goes up, and you don't necessarily get a premium for getting over the green bar. You get discounted if you go under it. Will they pay more for local? Yes, to a degree, if you get your story right. And again, using my language, that I say that in most cases, there's no margin in the noun, beef. The margin is in the adjectives: grass-fed, special breed, dry-aged, etc. So from a local point of view, I think if you can attach your product to that local story, that consumers like that, and they will pay more for that. How much more? Not a lot more, but some. Enough to make it worthwhile to develop that local brand. For sure. Again, back to my son with his restaurant. He's in Devon, the county Devon, and everything is local. And what is he? He's probably a 15% price premium to other restaurants in the area that just sell regular food. So, again, there's a certain proportion. And if I've got the time, just quickly, that the research shows too that those who are eco-active and who are willing to change their behavior to purchase products which they perceive to be more sustainable, perceive to be more eco-friendly, the richer you are, the more likely you are to change your purchasing behavior. The less rich you are, the less likely you are. Does that mean that poor people are not environmentally conscious? Not at all. I think almost everybody is now. But if they don't have the economic latitude, they'll continue to buy cheap food, feel slightly guilty about it, but then that's all they can do because they don't have a big enough purse.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They have to meet their budget first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're reaching the end of our hour together, so I think we'll have to wrap up the questions. So,
right.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you everybody for joining us. And I'll just turn it back to Shannon to wrap things up.
Perfect. Okay. It'll just be another minute of your time. So that was a wonderful presentation, David. Thank you so much. On May 29th, we'll have another webinar about long-term industry shifts that last beyond the pandemic, and that's with Professor Sylvain Charlebois, and he's a Canadian food security expert. Very interesting. I recommend that you sign up to come to that one as well, especially if you enjoyed today. We'll be sending out a post-event survey, so please let us know how to improve. We are new to webinars and really enjoying putting them on. And we'd love to know what you'd like to see next. If you're interested in learning more about David Hughes' research, you can go on to www.profdavidhughes.com or his blog, Supermarkets in Your Pocket. We'll be posting the webinar recording next week on PPAA.ca. You can also see the resources for our previous webinars and events. I highly recommend checking that out. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to our third webinar. And have a lovely, long May weekend. And
it's a long weekend.
Enjoy the sunshine. Thank you.
There we go. If they're still there, thanks very much for listening. And I hope that we managed to hit some decent spots.